In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire fell. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last emperor, sent the imperial regalia back to Constantinople, and declared himself king of Italy. Rome was over. Except it wasn't. Not yet. 60 years later, a Roman emperor looked at the ruins of everything the western provinces had once been and decided to take it all back. His name was Justinian. His general was Belisarius. And what followed was one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in the history of the ancient world. A near-total reconquest of the Western Mediterranean, achieved against impossible odds by a handful of men who fought smarter than anyone had any right to expect. Then, within 20 years of Justinian's death, almost all of it was gone. This is the story of how Rome came back, and why it could not stay. Justinian I became emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call Byzantium, in 527 AD. He was not a soldier. He was an administrator, a theologian, a builder, a lawmaker. He codified Roman law into a document that still forms the basis of legal systems across Europe and Latin America today. He built the Hagia Sophia, one of the greatest architectural achievements in human history. He was meticulous, obsessive, and absolutely convinced that his destiny was to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. The western provinces had been carved up by Germanic kingdoms. The Vandals held North Africa, the breadbasket of the ancient world, wealthy, strategically crucial, deeply irritating to anyone who remembered that it had been Roman for 600 years. The Ostrogoths held Italy and much of the Balkans. The Visigoths held Spain. Smaller kingdoms controlled Gaul and other territories. These were not temporary arrangements. These kingdoms had ruled for generations. They had their own kings, their own armies, their own administrative structures. They were not going away. Justinian decided they were going away. He sent Belisarius. Belisarius is one of the most fascinating military commanders in history. A man who won battles he had no business winning, who operated almost perpetually short of troops, short of supplies, and short of support from an emperor who simultaneously depended on him and distrusted him. He was in his late 20s when Justinian gave him his first major command. He would spend the next 30 years fighting across 3 continents, winning victories that reshaped the map of the Mediterranean, and never quite receiving the recognition or resources his achievements deserved. In 533 AD, Belisarius sailed for North Africa with approximately 15,000 men. The Vandal kingdom controlled one of the most prosperous regions in the world. Its army was large, its king was capable, and its capital, Carthage, was one of the great cities of the ancient world. Belisarius defeated the Vandal army in 2 battles. 2. Carthage fell. The Vandal kingdom, which had ruled North Africa for a century, ceased to exist in roughly 14 months. The Vandal king Gelimer was captured, paraded through Constantinople, and spent the rest of his life on a comfortable country estate in Galatia, which was about the most merciful outcome a defeated king could have hoped for. The speed of the North African campaign shocked everyone, including Justinian. It was faster and cheaper than anyone had imagined possible. It suggested that the Western reconquest was not just a dream, but a genuine strategic possibility. Italy was next. The Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy was more formidable than the Vandals had been. Italy was larger, harder to supply, with better natural defenses. The Goths were experienced fighters who had been ruling Italy for decades and had good reason to defend what they had built. The Italian campaign, which historians call the Gothic Wars, began in 535 AD and lasted, in its main phase, until 554 AD. Nearly 20 years. What should have been a straightforward reconquest became one of the most destructive conflicts in the history of the Italian peninsula. Belisarius invaded from Sicily, moving north through Calabria and Campania. He captured Naples after a siege. He took Rome, the city of Rome, the eternal city itself, in December 536. He had fewer than 10,000 men holding the city against a Gothic army that surrounded it with somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 soldiers. What happened next was a siege of Rome that lasted a year and 9 days. Belisarius held Rome with his tiny force against an army that outnumbered him by at least 10 to 1. He used sorties, counterattacks, supply runs, psychological operations, and relentless improvisation to keep the city from falling. He wrote constantly to Justinian begging for reinforcements. Justinian sent some, but never enough. The emperor was afraid of his own general. afraid that a man popular enough and successful enough might decide that he deserved the throne more than the man sitting on it. The Goths eventually gave up the siege. Belisarius advanced north again, taking city after city. By 540, he had pushed into the Gothic heartland in northern Italy and forced the Gothic king Victories to surrender. Italy seemed won. Justinian recalled Belisarius to the east, where the Sassanid Persian Empire was pressing on the eastern frontier. A new Gothic king, Totila, took advantage of the moment. Totila was brilliant. He reorganized the Gothic resistance, offered freedom to Roman slaves and serfs who joined his cause, and systematically picked apart the Byzantine control of Italy. Within a few years, he had retaken most of the peninsula. He retook Rome itself. 3 separate times the city changed hands during this conflict. He threatened Sicily. He built a fleet and raided Greece. Justinian sent Belisarius back to Italy in 544. But this time, the emperor gave him almost nothing to work with. A tiny army, inadequate supplies, no real support. Belisarius fought a grinding defensive campaign, unable to make progress, unable to stop Totila's advances. In 548, he wrote to Justinian effectively saying, "Either send me an army or send someone else." Justinian sent someone else. The someone else was Narses, the emperor's personal chamberlain, a eunuch who was over 70 years old and had spent most of his career as a court administrator. Narses turned out to be one of the finest generals of the 6th century. In 552, Narses led a much larger Byzantine force into Italy, perhaps 30,000 men, well supplied, carefully organized. At the Battle of Bustagalorum, he defeated and killed Totila. The Gothic army that had terrorized Italy for a decade was broken in a single engagement. Narses then pursued the remaining Goths, destroyed their last army at the Battle of Mons Lactarius, and by 554 the Gothic War was effectively over. That same year, Justinian's forces intervened in a Visigothic civil war in Spain, establishing a Byzantine foothold in the southeastern corner of the Iberian Peninsula. The Roman Empire now controlled North Africa, Italy, parts of the Balkans, and a chunk of Spain. The Mediterranean was, as the Romans had once called it, Mare Nostrum, our sea. Once again, the cost had been enormous. Italy had been devastated. The Italian population had been reduced by perhaps a third through war, famine, and plague. The senatorial aristocracy that had administered Italy for centuries was largely extinct, killed by the Goths, killed by the Byzantines, or simply died in the chaos. The cities were damaged. The agricultural system was disrupted. The infrastructure that had made Italy prosperous for centuries had been severely damaged. The reconquest that was supposed to restore Roman glory had, in many ways, destroyed the Roman world it was trying to recover. And then the Lombards came. In 568 AD, 3 years after Justinian's death, a Germanic people called the Lombards crossed the Alps into northern Italy. They were not a sophisticated imperial power. They were a tribal confederation, fierce fighters, with no particular strategic vision beyond taking land and settling it. Within a few years, they had overrun most of northern Italy. Milan fell. Pavia fell. The Po Valley, the richest agricultural region in Italy, fell. The Byzantine administration retreated to the coasts, to Ravenna, to Rome, to Naples, to Sicily, to the toe and heel of the Italian boot. They never recovered the interior. The Lombard invasion succeeded where the Goths had ultimately failed, and it succeeded for a simple reason. Italy was exhausted. 20 years of the Gothic Wars had stripped the peninsula of its defenders, depleted its resources, and broken its administrative structures. There was nothing left to resist a new invasion. The Byzantines could not send enough men and money to hold what they had just spent 20 years winning, because they had spent everything winning it. In Africa, the situation was more stable initially, but rebellions began almost immediately after the conquest. The local Berber populations had never been fully subdued. The military settlement that Justinian established was expensive to maintain and difficult to reinforce from Constantinople. The great wealth of the province was real, but so were the costs. Spain was more modest. The Byzantine presence in southeastern Spain lasted until the early 7th century, then was absorbed by the Visigoths. Within a generation, the dream of the Reconquest had become a nightmare of exhausted provinces, inadequate garrisons, and endless new threats that kept arriving faster than they could be dealt with. Why did it collapse so quickly? The first reason was overextension. Justinian's empire was fighting on too many fronts simultaneously. The Persians in the east, the Balkans in the north, and the Western reconquest all at the same time. The resources of even a wealthy empire have limits. Justinian reached them and then kept spending. The second reason was the Plague of Justinian. Beginning in 541 AD, a pandemic, probably bubonic plague, swept through the Byzantine Empire and the Mediterranean world. Millions died. Tax revenues collapsed. Military recruitment became impossible. The plague returned repeatedly over the following decades, preventing any recovery. A reconquest that might have been sustainable in a healthy empire became impossible to maintain in one losing a third of its population. The third reason was the nature of conquest itself. Taking territory is easier than holding it. Belisarius could defeat the Vandals in 14 months, making North Africa genuinely Roman again. Integrating it into the imperial administrative system, defending it against all threats, making it self-sustaining, was a generational project that required sustained investment and attention that the empire could not provide. The fourth reason was Justinian himself. He was brilliant, energetic, and strategically visionary. He was also controlling, paranoid, and unwilling to give his best generals the resources or authority they needed. Belisarius spent years of critical campaigns begging for reinforcements that never came in adequate numbers. The hesitation and the half-measures that came from an emperor who feared his own success stories cost the reconquest years of momentum that could not be recovered. Belisarius spent his last years in Constantinople, relieved of command, briefly imprisoned on suspicion of treason, then pardoned and restored to honor. He died in 565, the same year as Justinian. The two men who had rebuilt the Roman Empire died within months of each other. 3 years later, the Lombards crossed the Alps. Justinian's reconquest was not a failure. It was a genuine achievement, extraordinary in its scope, remarkable in its speed, astonishing in its execution. For a brief window, the Mediterranean really was Roman again. The law code that Justinian assembled during those years shaped European civilization for 1,000 years afterward. The Hagia Sophia still stands, but empires are not built in a single generation, and they cannot be reconquered in one either. What Justinian accomplished in 30 years required 100 years of work to sustain, and the resources for that work did not exist. Rome did not fall in 476. It fell slowly, over centuries, in stages, with heroic last stands and genuine revivals scattered between the collapses. Justinian's reconquest was one of those revivals. A real one, not a fantasy. It just could not last. The last Byzantine territory in Italy, the city of Ravenna and the surrounding region, held on until 751 AD. The last Byzantine territory in North Africa fell to the Arab conquests in 698 AD. The dream of Mare Nostrum lasted, in fragments, for another century after Justinian died. But the dream of a restored Western Empire ended in 568 when the Lombards crossed the Alps into an Italy that had been conquered and destroyed and could not be defended again. Belisarius won everything. Justinian reconquered the empire. And 20 years after they were both gone, it was over. That is not a story about failure. That is a story about the limits of what any single generation can accomplish against the weight of history.